MS Now White House reporter Jake Traylor joins me from Hebron, Kentucky. I also want to bring in David Drucker, an MS Now contributor and senior writer at The Dispatch. Cornell Belcher is an MS Now political analyst and Democratic strategist and pollster. Cornell, let's go out on a limb and conclude these two guys don't like each other very much. But as we saw last night in Georgia, Trump's endorsement can still be powerful, especially in a Republican district. So size this up, this potentially epic battle for the Republican nomination.
Well, it's interesting because, you know, you see his numbers collapsing, particularly with independent voters and moderate voters in the middle. But where you don't see Trump's numbers collapsing is, quite frankly, with the base of the Republican Party, the MAGA movement. They're still very much with him and enthusiastic about him. So it is really a tough thing for the congressman to be going up against the most popular figure in the base of the Republican Party. And in a primary where disproportionately you have the base, the most gung-ho MAGA supporters who are going to be deciding. But I got to tell you, I think sometimes we have seen it where it cuts both ways, right? And there's a principled stand that the congressman is taking here that I think a lot of voters will like and appreciate. I think particularly in the general election, if he can get beyond the primary.
Well, and arguably, David, particularly when it comes to the Epstein files, I mean, they feuded over the budget, they feuded over the war with Iran, but we do know that there are a lot of MAGA folks who aren't happy with the president and the way the whole Epstein files thing has been handled. But I wonder if that's enough, and if by the time we get to them actually casting their ballots, if that will matter enough for Massie. What do you think?
You know, look, there are a whole host of reasons why a lot of Republicans don't like Thomas Massie. The president, can almost get in line in that regard. But the president's tried to oust Massie in a primary before, and it hasn't worked. And so I'm sort of skeptical that he's going to be able to get him this time. You know, in the past, he went after Massie on some sort of more normal policy grounds and disloyalty to him. And, where Massie is now is standing his ground on the Epstein files, which is very important to particular quarters of the Republican base. And, in Kentucky, they sort of like their Republican congressman quirky. Rand Paul is a senator there, and Tom Massie sort of governs in that same vein. So, look, it's possible Massie his numbers finally up. But I think the president has a tall order here to get rid of him. And of course, if Massie does win his primary, it's smooth sailing in the general election.
Yeah. So, Jake, the president is heading your way. This trip is supposed to focus on Trump's affordability message, especially now with gas prices going up in addition to everything else. But I wonder what you're hearing on the ground there.
Yeah, Chris, look, the focus is supposed to be affordability, but there's, of course, these politics around it. Obviously, the Massie component, which our friends just spoke about. But there's also this gas price surge that's taking place across the country right now, where the president is coming here to convince the American people the economy is doing better than it's actually doing, telling them their pocketbooks aren't hurting as much as they actually are. But the folks that we've spoken with today realistically say that's not quite the case. But it is really notable because we've talked with a lot of Trump supporters through and through, MAGA people, that are saying they are feeling the effects of the increase at the price, the increase in price at the pumps, but they think that it's just a short-term thing. They say they listen to the president when he says it's only going to be for a little bit and it's going to get better. But whenever we pushed some of these MAGA Trump supporters a little bit more, asking what is the breaking point, they ultimately say when it comes to the war in Iran, when it comes to the spike at the pump, ultimately there comes a breaking point where they will stop supporting the president if they continue to see this spike go up. Today, likely, we expect to see the president pivot, not talk about gas prices, and instead focus on his plan for future affordability, though folks right now here, certainly in Kentucky, are feeling some of that pressure.
So, Cornell, according to the
I feel like he's gone against Trump in almost every issue that I believe in. And if he's not going to support Trump, that's who I voted for. He's supposed to be representing us, the voters. I feel like he's representing himself.
If there was a candidate that contrasted President Trump, but you still aligned with them, would that be okay with you? Or is it just mainly because he's gone against Trump?
Mainly because he's gone against Trump.
there, Chris, there seems to be this real allegiance to President Trump, even when it comes to Thomas Massie and who he endorses there. But ultimately, they say that they do feel these things. They do matter, and it is going to ultimately determine their future support of the president if things continue in the way they actively are going.
Jake, thank you so much. So, Cornell, you mentioned this. There are polls out there, and this one's from the Cook Political Report. Despite Trump's comments and actions, he's maintained support among his base. It's at 85% with Cook, some other numbers in that range elsewhere. And we know that Republican candidates have had a really hard time underperforming where he was in the 2024 election. In fact, here's a warning from Kentucky Senator Rand Paul.
I think the 2026 elections already, we are behind the 8 ball as far as the electoral process. I think if you add in high gas prices, high oil prices, and if we are still bombing Iran with kinetic action, people don't want to call it war, but if there's still kinetic action that causes oil to be over $100, I think you're going to see a disastrous election.
What's the disconnect here between how voters feel about Trump and Republican candidates on the ballot? Is there a big one?
It's the primaries, right? And I think to that point, and what that woman that was being interviewed just talked about is like, she's, if you're not for Trump, she's not for you, right? So that it's the primaries. It'd be interesting, Chris, to see once we get past the primary season, because I think the senator's political analysis is spot on. They're going to have to fundamentally try to change the dynamics of this, and they're going to have to fundamentally, and that means more of them actually behaving like Massie than not for a general election. Because what we see is that Trump's numbers and his policies have absolutely collapsed among independent voters. Like 60% of independent voters in the QPAC poll just a couple of days ago disapprove of the war in Iran. So I think it's going to be interesting after the primary season to see how a lot of these Republicans who are in these really frontline battleground districts, if they can find a way to sort of begin to sort of distance themselves from the president and fight for their survival, because they're going to have to if they're going to fight for their survival.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting parts about this, David. Trump has never been shy, certainly in this last year, about threatening members of his own party with primary challenges. But in some races, could that come back to haunt the Republicans?
Well, clearly, once we get into a general election campaign, if the president's numbers are still low, if there's still widespread disapproval, particularly among the independent voters that Cornell just mentioned, because independents will tell you how this midterm election is going to go. I mean, I can't emphasize it enough. One of the reasons, in fact, the reason that the Democratic Party didn't have a particularly horrible midterm election in 2022 is because they won the independent vote by 2 points. And so the independents always tell you the trajectory of a midterm election campaign, let alone a presidential campaign. The quandary Republican candidates find themselves in is that the president maintains a really good relationship with Republican voters. It's just solid. It's not just MAGA aligned, or I describe myself as MAGA. If you say that you're a Republican, you tend to like the president, and you don't like Republicans that fight with him. Obviously, you want to get through primary season. Then you have to deal with the fallout from that if you're in a swing district or a swing state, or things all of a sudden go south because of the economy and things like that. And it's just something that Republicans, just like Democrats and Republicans before them that have been in this situation, are going to have to deal with. And one difference is past presidents, whether it was Joe Biden or Barack Obama or George W. Bush and so on down the line, have always given their colleagues some leeway to distance themselves from the commander in chief, because they understand the challenges in a midterm election when you control the White House. And Trump just won't have any of it. And that's why Republicans are in a particular dilemma.